Hello everyone, and welcome to Economics Pat01. Now in Economics Pat01, I will be covering and giving a free economics lesson into the idea of how economic systems work. I'm going to start by placing the first analysis around capitalism. Now, in capitalism, most people would think that capitalism means the rich get wealthier. That's not essentially entirely the case, because essentially you see, if you are to create a large corporation as an example, you would find that you create a lot of jobs, which a lot of jobs allows a lot of employment. And a lot of employment allows people to put money in those pockets. Now, we might see a lower tax rate for higher class citizens in capitalism. Why might that be? Well, in understanding how business works, allow me to place this particular analysis for you. If I, as a business owner, every year reinvest my profit into my business in a business spent money, such as fuel for your fleets, resources, supplies, expanding offices, you name it. Anything you essentially put back into your business in order to expand, that is a tax deductible, which means you're not going to be taxed on the money you spent in order to expand your business. Now, as an idea, we might say, well, that just sounds like we're enriching the rich at this particular point, but we are not enriching the rich in capitalism. They may get a huge amount of revenue based on having a very large enterprise or business, corporation, you name it. But why do you think they have such a large enterprise, corporation, or business? Because every year, once again, they are reinvesting into their own company in order to create growth, expansion, more work, which means if they are creating more work as a corporation, and you as a civilian are essentially a jobless individual. In capitalism, we see a larger amount of job revenue, which larger amount of job revenue essentially allows you, as a person working, to dictate how much money you want to earn. The more you choose to work hard, the more money you make. The less you choose to work hard, the less money you make. And as a result of making less money, we then see that these particular individuals might say the rich are getting richer. Now, in understanding how capitalism works, there are certain few key limitations to capitalism, such as extremely large corporations all of a sudden having such a large work field in the entire world. They own a huge amount of the wealth. But how have they essentially gotten to be a worldwide corporation? By reinvesting and respending back into their business. So as an example, if we were to say tax the rich, but the rich are getting to that size of corporation by essentially specifically reinvesting into their corporation, which then creates a tax deductible. They will not be taxed on said income because it is technically not revenue. They have reinvested into their company. As a business owner or a CEO of said company, you might say pay yourself a salary of say $10 million to live happily a year, but your corporation, out of paying yourself said $10 million, out of paying yourself $10 million from your own corporation in salary, The $10 million is what you are taxed at, but in knowing your business, you've reinvested however many billions in order to create an expansion within said business, resulting in a larger workforce, a growth, granting more job revenue for a larger amount of the population, allowing each and every single individual to essentially get a job for themselves. The more we have large business or corporations essentially creating revenue, the more we have work in order for us as civilians, in order to basically say, according to how hard I choose to work or how little I choose to work, my success rate is entirely my responsibility. This is how capitalism works. In leftist communist societies, as an example, now that we have finished the conversation regarding capitalism, in communist societies, we often think in leftist ideology that the left means we are going to tax the rich and enrich and create an equal playing field for those that essentially don't necessarily want to work. I'm not going to keep placing the argument of those that don't want to work, but let me create this analysis for you. Notice how in leftist ideology we then see such a thing as unions, which unions are essentially a limiting power factor. In limiting your power factor or your ability to essentially grow, let me explain how a union works. If you work in a union, no matter how hard or how little you work, how early or how late you show up to work, how much experience or how little experience you might have, you essentially find that the overall potential, that the entirety of said union is going to essentially create a limiting factor for yourself as an individual. You might make pretty good money up until a certain point, because essentially unions completely demoralize the working force. If you are paid the same for having extreme amounts of experience and you are paid basically the same rate as somebody with zero experience, we then find a limiting factor: your potential to make more money. According to how you choose to work, well, you are limited, because no matter in a union, no matter how hard you work, how early you show up to work, how much experience you might have, you essentially are limited up to the maximum you will earn and no more than that. We find unions are often run by the rich, very large corporations. And very large corporations specifically tell people to vote for the left. It's a secret. When you look at celebrities as an example, whom are rather wealthy individuals. Let's imagine an individual such as Taylor Swift. Sorry to be bringing you into the equation, Mrs. Swift. But as an example, out of being a billionaire singer-songwriter, you might find you yourself employ union employees, which in union employees you get to dictate essentially the potential that individual will grow within your organization. In creating unions, you essentially create a way to maximize your revenue as a wealthy person. But the more you can limit an individual's ability to generate wealth by essentially limiting their potential factor that drives their morality into wanting to succeed. If more individuals are demoralized and not wanting to succeed, we then find they have a comfort in essentially accepting, well, I have it pretty good, doesn't need to get better. Now this might be a bit of a rant that I'm going to be beginning here, but allow me to place this particular fact. If extremely large corporations, as an example, let's imagine Amazon. As an Amazon employee, you might have a certain maximum wage you can potentially earn if you stay in this particular organization, at whichever level you essentially work. But at each particular level is a new set union at each particular level, resulting in essentially limiting wage factors in order to control and exactly know how much money you can keep for yourself as a corporation or wealthy individual, a business owner, on and on and on. The more I can create unionized systems at all levels, essentially the more I can create a way to control my capital, my money. And the more I can control my money by essentially creating a certain small enough number to pay each employee that they will be happy enough but not wanting to pursue leaving said company or choosing to work harder, get a promotion, on and on and on. Essentially, creating union-like structures creates a limiting factor to your potential as a working individual. Now you might ask, how is this benefiting or enriching the rich? Well, let's see. If based on the fact that the rich essentially get rich by paying themselves or reinvesting into their company. Now, the moment you reinvest into your company, and this is where knowing how both systems work, and I'm going to begin placing the comparisons between communism and capitalism. Now, in capitalism, we might find that large corporations essentially create large job revenue. Notice that large corporations are also a lobbying factor in the policies that which you might be voting for. And understanding communism, imagine you are already a nation that is struggling to create revenue. And the more you are struggling to create revenue, the more they tax you on said revenue because you yourself can't reinvest it in yourself, resulting in you essentially, your pockets are getting empty. The more we limit the potential factor of how much an individual can choose to work, how much they can make, and how much we increase the price of taxes, the cost of living, the cost of consumer goods such as groceries, the cost of fuel in order for you to go to work. And then we find an infinite division of your money being pulled out of your pocket. The more we create a way to pull the money out of your pocket from taxing you, increasing the cost of living, on and on and on, well, you're left with, you're struggling to survive, you can't reinvest in yourself, and as a result of not being able to reinvest in order to create your potential or success in life, well, we find that in communist or leftist systems, the more we increase the potential idea that taxing the rich is going to essentially create an evenness across the playing field by redistributing the wealth. This is what is known as a false hope. Why might I be saying this is a false hope? Well, allow me to place this particular analysis for you. In understanding the economic nature of business, imagine if you can't reinvest in yourself. What do you think happens? You are stuck. Now, in being stuck, what would you say would be a limiting factor that could control or increase your potential? The rate at which you choose to work. Which if all of a sudden we demoralize the worker, they choose to work minimal hours, such as a full-time job if you are of a union, such as 8 hours a day. Now, in understanding the way the tax systems work, imagine if I essentially create a system that causes you as an individual to believe that voting for the left will create this equal playing field. Now, how many corporations are extremely wealthy in the world? Very few. In Canada alone, I would say there's maybe 10 people that are worth at least $1 billion. Which if they're worth $1 billion, let me place this analysis for you, and you may see how the left is essentially a false hope. In knowing how taxes work, you can actively find that the moment an individual of, say, these, let's name 10 billionaires in Canada, not by name, but as imagination, as an example. I'm sure they exist. We have lots of huge corporations. But in the idea that's saying, tax the rich in order to create equality or an even level of spread of said wealth, allow me to rewind back to the tax deductibles portion of the video. The moment I, as a business owner, corporation, or wealthy individual, reinvest into my business or my corporation, what ends up happening is most of the revenue goes back into the corporation, resulting in its expansion. But the actual CEOs, or what we call rich people, they're only paying themselves a smaller number out of said large amount of money their business has made. Most people think that a corporation is one person's entire wealth. Technically it is, technically it's not. When you look at a man like Jeff Bezos as an example, who's worth $250+ billion, how much money do you think he might be spending on himself annually? Well, let's see. Amazon is worth $250 billion, and Jeff Bezos, in his actual payment to himself as being the CEO of Amazon, well, you could see that he pays himself a certain sum, a lump sum every year, which has accrued now to $250 billion, which begs the question, how big of a company is Amazon? Now, Jeff Bezos is technically a US citizen, so let's take a smaller individual, such as, say, an oil and gas company. Or how about Brookfield? That's a good one. In analyzing the structures of Brookfield, and I'm not claiming this to create essentially defamation, I'm simply creating a way to create a business analysis. Allow me to erase the name Brookfield from this. Let's call it the Pat Burns cattle business. If I, as a business owner, say, pay myself a much smaller percentage of my annual revenue that my business makes, and the rest of said money is reinvested into said business to create growth, you would find that taxing the rich does not solve anything. Because essentially, if we are to say tax 10 people that make around $10 million a year, how is that going to solve the economic crisis? If we were to say tax even 50% of their $10 million a year, which they're only paying themselves out of their business, a CEO rate. At the CEO rate, that's their actual net worth as an individual. Each year, that is their salary, which if we have 10 people or 10 CEOs that are making about $10 million a year, and we say we need to tax the rich and equality and an even spread of the potluck. What do you think a country or corporation ruling a country is going to make more money off of? If a government was to say tax 10 people with an annual revenue of $10 million a year at 50%, you would find you're only generating $50 million of taxpayer money. Now imagine instead, as a leftist individual or a leftist government, rather than taxing the rich themselves, we increase the taxes of the middle and lower class. And what essentially happens is, if you are either upper middle class or lower middle class, you essentially create an erasure. You erase the middle class. And now you only have upper class and lower class citizens in the economy. In leftist ideology, or communism specifically, you see an increase in the tax rates of the tax brackets of much smaller income families, individuals, on and on and on. Which the more you can tax multiple millions of people at a certain percentage of their income, such as say, imagine we tax 30 million people making around $50,000 to $100,000 a year, and we tax them at about say 40 to 60% of their revenue. This is already the low class number, $50,000 to $100,000 a year. Which technically means if you're being taxed at $100,000 bracket, your annual income is closer actually to about $40,000. The rest is all going to taxes. That's if you're making $100,000. So let's times, imagine now, if we're lucky, that every person working in Canada says makes an average of $100,000 a year, if we're lucky. And we are actively taxing 60% of that $100,000 through 30 million people. What do you think is going to create a larger revenue for the government in order to essentially enrich the government officials, which they will then spend said money, just as Mark Carney did? Because essentially we're seeing that in communist societies, if you were to tax 30 million people making $100,000 a year at 60%, let's multiply that. What is 30 million times 60,000? Well, you would see that that's a much larger number than 50 million from taxing 10 rich individuals making around $10 million a year, taxing them at 60%. 10 times 60 times divided by half, we arrive essentially much smaller number. We arrive closer to 30 million. Now, in this false hope led by leftist ideology, here's my economic lesson for you. I hope it was informational. And now we can actively see that the left is essentially feeding you a false hope. Not only are they limiting your factors as your potential to work harder, resulting in you being able to earn more, get promoted, on and on and on. you are essentially, in capitalism, you are rewarded for the work you do, whereas in capitalistic societies, pardon me, let me rewind that. In capitalistic societies, if I work, I'm the one rewarded for my work. Whereas in communistic societies, others are rewarded for the work I do. And the more we reward others for the work that you or I do, well, essentially we're seeing we should be creating a large potluck, right? If this is that the communist system creates more money and might create more tax generated money, which essentially if we're generating huge amounts of money as taxpayers, where is it all going? The governments get to live wealthily, the corporations get to live wealthily in communist societies, whereas if you were to actively look and analyze the capitalistic system, you would find you yourself have a greater potential for success if you choose to push yourself a little harder. Now you might say, that sounds difficult. Well, let me tell you what's about to be difficult. Currently, Mark Carney, sorry to throw you under the bus, Mr. Prime Minister, but as you have claimed you are an economic genius, I happen to know a thing or two about economics myself. And in understanding this particular concept, we can actively find that leftist governments, such as leftist government officials, are also lobbied by large corporations. The more you increase the tax rates of their workers, the lower they essentially have to pay back as a corporation in taxes, because their workers not only are paying their own taxes, but in being a business, you pay your taxes according to the salaries you pay your workers. Now, if you pay your workers a unionized set wage that they cannot budge up from, well, essentially that creates a limiting factor, which means every year they're going to be taxed a certain amount based on a set fixed number of hours. And based on set fixed number of hours and set revenue, each employee essentially is taxed in the same bracket, which at each particular union level of this leftist government's unionized system, you can actively create a way to essentially control the rate you will be paying taxes as a corporation. The less money I pay my employees, the smaller their tax bracket, the smaller my tax bracket is, because I'm not spending a huge amount in order to create the spending on my employees. The less money I make as a business, the less I may invest in my people, in my workers. Now, in knowing how taxes work, how do you think taxes work in a capitalistic society? As I've just displayed to you, in a unionized system, you essentially create a way to control your own wealth as a large corporation. You literally control and have an exact estimate of how much money you're going to be spending each year on your employees, and how much money you can then spend to create a wealthier life for yourself. In saying that, you can actively find that in communist societies, there is only upper and lower class. Whereas in capitalistic societies, we have upper, middle, upper and middle, and lower class. In these particular classes, the rate at which you choose to work dictates the rate of your success, which means as an individual in a capitalistic society, you are entirely responsible for your success. But in knowing that capitalistic societies essentially create lower tax brackets, resulting in now more money going into your pocket according to how much you choose to work. The more money you make, the lower the tax bracket, and the lower the tax bracket, the more money you make. It's a reward system. You are rewarded for the work you do, which means if you make a lot of money in 1 year, you get to keep a lot of money that year because you're going to be taxed very minimally. And you might say, well, that sounds like the same system just explained in a different way. It all dictates according to where you choose to essentially buy in. Do you choose to buy into a system that limits your potential? Or do you choose to buy into a system that allows your potential to essentially take off if you choose to essentially say, I as an individual am responsible for my own success, whereas in a communist society, you are essentially saying others are rewarded for my work. Their success is a result of my work. And you could actively see in leftist communist societies, the rich are actually getting richer. Whereas in capitalistic societies, the poor are getting richer. Now, in understanding how these particular analyses can be placed, where might you sit as an individual or a viewer? Are you of a higher class, middle class, or lower class? And if you are of a lower class, would you like to have the opportunity to have a potential in life? Because essentially communist societies erase said potential. In communist societies, it is the rich that get richer, whereas in capitalistic societies, it gives the poor the opportunity and a potential to get richer. The ultimate truth behind it is entirely up to you as an individual how you choose to create your own success. Would you like to be limited in your potential success, resulting in having a life you might not necessarily be horrid by, but you're not necessarily happy with it either? Or would you like a life you have the potential to essentially create the best amount of life you can by simply saying, I choose how much money I get to earn based on how much work I choose to do? Thank you for watching. Until next time.